This coffees?
Yeah.
That's good.
Three ladies.
Hope it's stinky.
Teresa Burns,
It's
President,
regular.
UW Platteville. Kristal Prohaska, who's retired.
Lifelong resident.
Yeah, okay. And Laurie, Graney. And anyway, one of the things we decided to do was on Indian Park, Mysteries of Indian Park. We have
Hi, Barb.
obtained so much information.
You missed the big meeting
This
so
is
far.
the first presentation. We're going to have another one in April called The Mysteries of Indian Park Revealed. Laurie and Kristal have done a lot of the work. Terry can do most of the presentation. So I will turn it over to Terry.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Could you stay?
All right,
Just get arrested.
okay, that better? I think I've got it. So I think basically I'm the mount for all of your
I
research.
have enough cookies.
All right, so, yeah. Okay. And I take directions sort of well. Okay. So, you all probably know where Indian Park is, and we're going to talk about some of the mysteries of Indian Park. And I'm going to see if I can operate this and talk at the same time. There. Okay. So, Indian Park is only about a block from here. Does everyone here recognize this park? I figure if you're here, you know where it is, right? We're here. It's there. I can use snipping tool really well. Wow. So you're here. It's there. So as I was talking to Kristal and Laurie about this, and they've worked on this for at least a couple years, and really, Laurie has notes going, well, for back to 1975, and then some of the clippings that you are much older than that. Part of the challenge here was, I think, for the two of you to explain, I'll do this, for the two of you to explain to me in a way that I could get my mind around it, because so many things seem to intersect into this one little tiny park. And what I knew, and I've been here 25 years, was just that it was kind of a neat place to barbecue. Some kids found it creepy, some people thought it was haunted, but mainly it was just this little park. So these were some of the mysteries we started exploring. First, whether the mound in the middle of it was an Indian mound. Then there were stories that I'll get back to in a bit about a large group of native people that gathered there about a century ago. And I have handouts later on a lot of this material, but Philip Millhouse has done a lot of research on who the native people in this area were and their connection to mining. And Kristal and also Gary Prohaska have also done a lot of research into that. So if you're there, you notice that there's an 1812 veteran, Thomas Aiken, whose descendant, Dick Graney, is back here. He's in the cemetery, and then there's this second stone that no one can read, and many of us have tried. So if you have any clue about that, we'd love to hear it. One of the reasons that the next one is the Mysteries of Indian Park Revealed is if anyone here has information that you'd like to share, all three of us would just love to hear it. And we have our contact information on some of our handouts here. So then this property was like bought and sold like hotcakes, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense unless you start imputing other things from the context around it. So that's a mystery. Why were the deeds so goofy with it? And let's see. So Laurie put together this handout, which is called What She Knows About Indian Park, because unless you're a genius or have eidetic memory or something, holding this all in your head at one time, it was at least too much for me to do, and I consider myself a relatively bright person. So, so the context that we started looking at it were of Ho-Chunk people living in the area, and originally they were among the people who taught the early miners of European ancestry something about mining combined with European techniques. My source on that is Philip Millhouse, and here's his article for anyone who wants that. So you have the context of who was in this area before the European settlers. And then after that, those same people worked in the mines, and not I'm sure under ideal circumstances. You know, there were people who died working in the mines. But as Gary Prohaska found out looking at census records, in this area, through at least 1850, Native people were still a majority population. And there was a rather large Native population here through the turn of the last century. Also, it shocked me to learn, as someone who 25 years ago I was not from around here, now I feel like I am, but that the highest concentration of Native burial mounds is right here in southwest Wisconsin, in the whole country. So another context is the cholera epidemic. It claimed many victims, including Thomas Aiken and others in his family. So at the same time that's going on, you can find newspaper articles talking about the cholera epidemic in other places, and then later in B-Town. You don't find a lot about it here. Well, think about that. If you're Rountree, the founder of Platteville, and you're trying to recruit people to work in your mines, who's going to want to come work in the mines where there's a cholera epidemic going on? So one can't prove yet, but one can suspect that there's a kind of suppression of people who died of cholera because General Rountree is also trying to get people to come work in his mines. And at the same time, there's a split between churches in town that come out against slavery and some that are either pro-slavery and or just don't have an opinion. And I know a lot of you know that. I mean, you know there's a stop in town that was part of the Underground Railroad, and yet in recent years we've heard about Rachel, the slave of Rountree, in a supposedly free state after the Emancipation Proclamation and so on. Okay, so this is a picture that Kristal took, and some of you, if you have been here, especially for more than 20 years or so, you know there was another sidewalk under the current sidewalk. So the level of the park has gone higher and higher, which might explain why, oh, and this is Jessica Broglie's picture that is on Street View from, in Google Maps, okay? For educational purposes only, snipped here for your viewing pleasure. So that's the grave of Thomas Aiken, who's a War of 1812 veteran. Actually, let me go back just a minute. So this, the mound in the center that isn't very high would really have been that much higher, like a couple feet higher, was the point of that picture. So I want to say a little about Thomas Aiken and his descendants and some of the work that they did. This is from the Platteville Journal, July 1976, and all of these pictures, Laurie Graney, who is the one who collected them, she has. But this is when the marker was put in the park that's there now. In this picture is Laura Graney, not to be confused with Laurie Graney, who was instrumental in getting that marker put in. Now, by the time I get to the end of this presentation, And I know I'm talking kind of fast because there's quite a bit here to go. We're going to work backwards from July 1976 and some work that Graney did. But anyway, recently, just a couple years ago, the Platteville Journal ran another story on that, the soldier buried in the park. And that work, that article by James Hibbard, many of you know James Hibbard, he's the archivist over at UW Platteville. So here we get to the mystery of how can you have a playground on top of a cemetery or a park on top of the cemetery? Hopefully we will answer that question when we come back to you, but the short answer is supposedly the bodies were removed, except they weren't removed because we know 2 of them were there. And there's no record of any of them being removed. Now, this is the grave, speaking of the graves of Thomas Aiken and Eleanor Donaldson that were not removed in 1917. On the timeline that's gone around, 1917 is the date by which everyone who was buried there was supposed to be removed. But, as I said, there's no record of anyone being removed. And Graney wrote in 1975, the picture of her was 1976, having the gravestone put there. In 1975, she wrote in and said that her grandfather, William Aiken, who was the son of Thomas Aiken, was still there, and they couldn't remove him because of fear of cholera. Now, this article, which I think we have, there's no date we have for that, right? It's around the turn of the century anyway. Probably, I think, by 1898. So you'll notice in this article from the Lancaster Teller, it says, although there were about 30 bodies buried there, the ground has never since been used as a cemetery. So what happened to those 30 bodies? And also, there's this. Have some of you seen this stone? If anyone has a clue of what those words say, I mean, we've tried looking at it and figuring it's Roman numerals. We thought we got it to say Montgomery, but then nope, didn't say Montgomery. So there's one article that says it's Smith, and I'm certain it's not Smith. So, any leads on that, we'd all 3 love to hear. It is of the size of huge stone that, as you both have pointed out, were used, say, on the Oregon Trail when someone died and people were going on, that you just are, it's huge. It's much bigger than a marker. It's like to keep something from digging up whomever is there. So this is a partial timeline of the one that just went around. So as you can see here in the beginning, and if this interests you a lot more and you want copies of this whole presentation, we did bring some. So Thomas Aiken and his family came to Platteville in 1837. He purchased a farm, 80 acres in Section 2. His descendants have lived here ever since. And one of those descendants I know the best is Dick, who is here today. Though there are other descendants in the area. So, Laura and her mother, Sarah Aiken, were teachers by profession. They were well respected in the Platteville community. And to skip down, Laura married Wilburn Graney in 1940, hence Dick's last name. Okay, so that family homestead is 181 years old now. So, another player in this, 1847, Reverend John Lewis. Some of you here may still go to the church that has Reverend Lewis's picture. He was very well thought of. They arrived here from New Diggings. And they founded Platteville Academy, which was, and of where we are now has a Lewis Street address. It's based after this Reverend John Lewis.
As a new teacher, I inherited Laura Graney's classroom.
Did you? Wow, that's pretty cool. And so he became pastor of the Presbyterian Church. If there are any sort of scholars of church history here, you'll know the Presbyterian Church nationally broke into several schisms over the Civil War, pro-slavery, anti-slavery, and it appears in Platteville it was no different. So in 1848, John Rountree, who I haven't introduced, but you all know who John Rountree was, right, the founder of Platteville. So he deeded lands to the Presbyterian Church to be used as a burying ground. That's where Indian Park is now, and it was called Hillside Cemetery. Now, what this deed states is that the land is to be used for and in consideration of their respect for the Christian burial of the dead. The land is to be forever a cemetery, not to be used for any purpose whatsoever, or for any other purpose whatsoever. So that will become important when we start looking at the swapping in and out of deeds, all of which we're not going to try to get through in this hour, but that's why Laurie put those together on a handout. So the Wisconsin State Legislature in 1849 passes an Act, Chapter 25, that authorizes the Presbyterian Church in Platteville to change its name and form of government. And the rest of that act is on the handout. So, yeah, they become the Congregationalist Church, as I heard someone say. So from this point on, and this is what I found so fascinating about, and I'm so grateful to Kristal and Laurie for bringing me in on their search here. The mystery of Indian Park, of the Roundtree estate, the cemetery, the Presbyterian and Congregationalist church history all become intertwined. They become intertwined with the surrounding context of disappearing native, particularly Ho-Chunk peoples, and the surrounding context of mining, and of course the Civil War. It is not an overstatement to say that most political conflicts in Platteville at that time become telescoped into this little piece of land. So, 1849, there's a deed recorded in Grant County that this deeds the Presbyterian Church property to the Congregationalist Church for the sum of $1. The deed mentions the special act passed by the Wisconsin State Legislature. That's the previous thing mentioned, which was approved on February 6, 1849. And it specifically states that with this property is a certain 1-acre lot described and used as a burying ground. So, 1850, Thomas Aiken and Eleanor Donaldson die of cholera, and they're buried in the Presbyterian or Congregational burying ground that becomes Hill Cemetery, that becomes Indian Park. Eunuch Sandford dies of cholera in 1855 and is buried in the Presbyterian or Congregational burying ground. And Laurie, do you want to say more about this? You were looking for who died of cholera in Platteville at that time, right? Do you?
I contacted the Grant County Genealogical Society, and I was able to get a document that gave me a few more names. One was Eunuch Sandford. I can find it here quick. Sorry.
I want you to notice how much research Laurie has done.
Okay, one was Eunuch Sandford. He died in 1855. Then there's a notation here by a gentleman by the last name of Bellwood. And it says he was the first husband of a Mary Ann Robinson. And he also died in 1850 of cholera. Then Bill put some feelers out on Facebook when we first started this quite some time ago. And someone had mentioned something about one of the powder mill explosions, and there was one in 1850, which would fit this time period. And there's an article that I found that said that pieces of this gentleman that was in the accident had been found, and they put it in a lunch pail, the pieces, and that he was just buried in a cemetery. That's about all I know, I guess.
That was far more. You'll never think about, I'll never think about a lunch pail. Yeah. Okay, so 1855 is this warranty deed between John and Lydia Rountree and John Lewis. And it's for 21 acres that surround the area of Indian Park. 1855, the county surveyor says that they've laid out lots. 1856, there's a release of mortgage. And so far, this just seems like normal land transfers, although that's an awful lot of them given the period of time it was. But right here is where you start hitting stuff that's a little bit odd. That John Lewis and Electa Lewis deed it to E.W. Covell, but this isn't recorded until 1875, which is long after Lewis is dead. Okay. So, of the many things that we know about John Hawkins Rountree, well, we know his middle name after Hawkins is after a slave trader. And by the way, I'm not trying to kick Rountree here. It's just there are reasons why he and Reverend Lewis would not have gotten along. For instance, we've heard about Rachel, who my colleague Gene Tesdall and his students did a lot, putting a headstone in where Rachel, his house slave, was buried. He had another colored manservant, and so in any case, it would be hard to argue that Mr. Rountree was anything but a proponent of slavery, whereas John Lewis was not. Here's John Lewis looking like he's sort of tired of dealing with the whole thing. That's his gravestone. But he was much beloved. And so we're going to look at the minor mystery of his burial, and whether it was Hillside Cemetery or Hill Cemetery, because sometimes those two cemeteries are confused. Now keep in mind, we're here at an address that's on Lewis Street, and we're real close to Indian Park. So when Reverend Lewis died in 1860, he's a very young man, only 43. People even referred to him as St. John. He was so beloved. He's laid to rest on an afternoon of autumnal splendor, and the entire Platteville Academy, which is also very close to here at that time, followed him to his burial. And as both Kristal and Laurie have pointed out, it would make a lot more sense to think he was being taken to Hill Cemetery, which is a block away, than that this whole crew walked across town to Hillside Cemetery.
Gary,
Yeah.
I don't think, did you mention it? Hill Cemetery was once the name of Indian Park.
Right, I think, yeah, I think I did, but probably.
Why a hill is not a hill?
I don't know. Kent Sherrill has asked why, when there's not a hill there, maybe a mound?
The mound.
Yeah.
Oh, that little.
Yeah, and the mound would have been higher because the fill on top is added at least 2 feet. Supposedly also, and we're looking for a picture of this as well, supposedly there was also a wrought iron fence around it. I think Gary Prohaska remembers it there in the late 60s, but we can't find any record of how long it was, when it was taken down. Or pictures. Who has a picture? We'd love to take a picture of your pictures. So, anyway, Lewis's estate is probated, and then in 1861, the ownership of the cemetery goes to Grant County. Now, according to the Register of Deeds, and this is all Laurie's research, this shouldn't have happened, because it's a cemetery, and cemeteries aren't supposed to be taxed. Although then you get a tax amount of $2.71 due from 1857. Yeah?
It was in the, if a person looks up the deed also on the taxes, it says illegal, written right in pencil. God only knows when it was done, because pretty well everything was written in pencil at that time. But it does state, when the person verified the taxes being paid, that it was, and that was 2 years in a row that that was written in.
Oh, thanks. Did you?
How, the original Indian Park, how much larger was that than the one that we see today? Or is it the same size?
I think it was 1 acre.
41 feet and 6 inches was taken off the south side of the park.
Wow. So I will defer to my fearless leader.
At some point, I think it was the late 1800s, there was a court case that went before Grant County, and the Rountree family was given 41 feet 6 inches off the south side of the park.
Which would be Second Street or the other side?
It would be the Lewis Street side, the south
Okay.
side of the park.
And then at that point, that was broken up into homesteads, or whatever you call the area?
No, the court document said, okay, 41 feet 6 inches went to the Roundtree family for whatever reason, I'm not sure why. But the remainder of the park was to stay for cemetery purposes.
Thank you.
Great question. I wouldn't remember enough at this point to ask it, which please come talk to us after, and we'd love to know why you asked that question. So some of you know probably about there was a cholera epidemic that decimated B-Town, and there's a kind of inferred connection you can make from W.R. Beach. He represented Grant County in the purchase of this cemetery, and he also shows up in the history of Grant County mentioned where the writer is talking about B-Town. So now we're to the mound in the middle, which doesn't look very mound-like anymore, but it would have been a couple of feet higher. And there again is Kristal's picture of when they were laying the new sidewalk there. If you look at who the native people were in the area, according to the founder of Sinsinawa, because this is his map, you find in this area mainly Winnebago or Ho-Chunk people. And that corresponds with the later research done by Philip Millhouse. Now, we used to have powwows here every year. They ended about 10 years ago. And, you know, I would often ask as part of who was in this area. But the main people in this area were the Ho-Chunk, but they weren't the only people in this area for a variety of reasons. One being that people were being recruited to work in the mines. So you're having to go back before Europeans, not at the time where there's people of European ancestry that are mining. And then you're talking about mainly Winnebago people. Yeah.
Is there any way to find the tribal names of the old chunk ancestors that were here at the time, if they're the ones that moved to the